And if you have time for all these books, that's fine. You know, it took me 10 years to read them all, but I'm sure glad I did. All right, but at any rate, they tried to infiltrate England, and that didn't happen right away as far as that was concerned. But what they did was they created what was called the League of the Just Men. They also started the French Revolution. In 1791, you had the French Revolution. The French Revolution was the prototype. If you understand the French Revolution, you understand all these so-called socialist or communist revolutions that have taken place ever since. The king was not even involved in it. It was, or the French people weren't even involved in it. It was a foreign group of people who were brought in from the southern Mediterranean, and they were dressed up like French people, and they were all laughing because men were dressed up like women and everything. And then they went and they stormed the Bastille and they cut the king's head off. A few miles away, guys were farming. The French people didn't know anything what was going on. We're taught in history this was the French people rising up against their king. The king simply would not have a bank. After the French Revolution, France had a bank. And they put their revolutionary functionaries in there, Robespierre, Danton, Saint-Just, Marat, and they kept guillotining these guys until they ended up with Napoleon in 1801. And he was a 24-year-old general. It seems that 24-year-old generals don't ask many questions. They just do what they're told, don't they? He went ahead and conquered Italy and Austria, put them under the Rothschild influence. Of course, then he came back, wanted to be king of France, and he was exiled into England because they didn't want him king of France. And he came back to take over France, and he was going to work with Wellington out of England. Of course, Wellington attacked him, surprise, and that was called Waterloo. When Nixon tried to do it, they called it Watergate. Okay, so anyway, you see, you don't go back on the boys when you start playing their game. You just don't do it. It's considered bad. They own you if you play ball with them. And the revolution always eats its own, as we can see with our Senator Cranston, who now has some serious problems and can't run for re-election again. He's out of favor with the bank. Okay, and of course we can go to the savings and loans, and all it is putting them under the Federal Reserve System because they weren't. You see, anytime there's a problem, well, our taxes take care of it, and the boys go under the control of the Red Star. Is this fun or what? Okay, now we understand federal savings and loans. Hey, we're moving. Okay, now 1791. Okay, in 1812 they created an organization called the League of the Just Men after Saint-Just, one of the conspirators up here, and their plan was to come up with a program that would have people all over the world voluntarily give up their property to the bank. And this, of course, took some serious thinking. This took many, many years of talking and planning and so forth. And finally, by 1832, there was a fellow in the United States in New York by the name of Clinton Roosevelt. Clinton Roosevelt came up with a plan that he thought would enable this bank to control all the property in the world. And he put it in a little booklet, and he mailed it over to the Bank of England. And his plan called for, number one, the abolition of all private property. Isn't that interesting? The abolition of private property. He said this would be done in the next 9 platforms. The first one would be a heavy, progressive, graduated income tax. And he said the next one would be so that if a guy made any money, he couldn't keep it. The next one would be inheritance tax. So if he had any property, he couldn't give it to the next generation. It would have to be given back to the bank, which is controlled by the government, which is controlled by the bank. The fourth platform was a confiscation of all property of rebels. A rebel is identified as anyone who doesn't pay the first 2 taxes. You've heard of tax rebel? It's not a new term, is it? You see? Okay, the fifth platform was that there would be a central bank. In other words, the boys would have to go in and print the money. It wouldn't be printed from inside the country. And to spare you the agony, I'll just go down to the 10th platform, that the government would run all schools. Isn't that interesting? That was the platform, okay? It was sent over there, and there was a fellow named Engels, who was the head of the Rothschild Bank in Vienna, in Austria. And he had a son by the name of Frederick. And so they said, well, look, we'll have this guy write this up, introduce it in England, and we'll call it the Communist Manifesto. Isn't that interesting? So the bank produced their document to confiscate all land, and they said, first of all, it has to look like it's not a bank. So they said, okay, we want to make it look like it's a popular movement, okay? But they said, well, it still doesn't look like a popular movement because this guy's the banker's kid. And they said, aha, what we need is some guy that can put this over. So in 1867, the first manuscript that ever came along with Karl Marx's name on it. Isn't that interesting? And now Karl Marx is credited with having written the document. He wrote that document about as much as he wrote the LA phone book. Okay? He just simply put his name on because they needed a diversion. They needed a distraction to show that this was not a bank repossessing property. This was actually a hippie movement, if you will, of people that just wanted to own everything in common. Oh, really? Interesting. All right. From 1867 until 1913, every year the income tax was introduced in the United States. And every year it failed. 66 years go by. Every year, income tax failed, income tax failed, income tax failed. Finally, the Supreme Court in 1895 said, look, even if the income tax passes in the United States, it can't pass because it's a direct tax. See, what happened here was back in the days of our founding times here, our fathers in their wisdom did some interesting things. And they said that they realized that they had, 13 separate countries over here. They had Connecticut, Vermont, Rhode Island, Virginia, Delaware, New York, and everything. And so, historically, these countries would have problems if they didn't have some type of a central government here to stop the smuggling, to make sure there were no trade embargoes, and so forth. So they realized that there had to be some regulation from inside. Now, the problem is they did not want this government to be the sovereign. They said, we want the sovereign up here, okay? We want the sovereign, or the ruler, as Solomon says, to be the citizens in the states. Now, how could you make it so that the government now, in other words, if this were the citizens, how could you make it so that the government was the servant? And this is the kind of government they gave us. And they said, okay, what we have to do is make sure that the servant cannot tax a master. So that's one of the conditions, that the servant cannot tax the master. And they said, well, how are we going to fund this government? And they said, aha, it's going to be an indirect tax or a transactional tax, and you can tax transactions such as business and sales. But you can't tax a master in his income or his property. Isn't that interesting? And so they had written in the Constitution that they could tax on excise, imposts, tariffs, duties, and these things. They're enumerated. What is a legal tax, you see? Notice income tax is not there. We're up to 1913 or up to 1912, income tax doesn't show up, okay? And so when the Supreme Court come along and said, look, you guys are trying to pass a tax from the master on, from the servant on the master, and even if you did it, the Supreme Court's going to throw it out. So back to the drawing board. These guys were busy, 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 because, hey, there's nothing more profitable than running a country like the United States. So they had plenty of time, plenty of money to put this together. So they said, what we need to do then is change the Constitution. We have to change that aspect so it's okay for the servant to tax his master. They introduced it in 1913 as the 16th Amendment. They couldn't get anybody hardly to do it. They finally passed it through 4 state legislatures, but they had control by that time of the school system, and they had control of the news media, so nobody knew it. There's a book out called The Law That Never Was by William Benson. William Benson has been imprisoned. He's been given drugs. He's been brutally tortured in an Illinois prison. Probably, I don't know if he's still alive or not. But the publishing of this book cost him his life in 1990. We're not talking 1763. We're talking 1990. The boys don't like it when you publish this information. They get mad. See? All right? And he showed that the law was never ratified by more than 4 state legislatures. And it was supposed to have been ratified by, I don't know, 18 or 19. Didn't quite make it, did it? But we don't know it because we get the news that they want us to get, and we go to the schools that they want us to go to. And that's where we get our information. Is this fun or what? And they got Waltons and Daltons all tied up. You can't get anything in the bookstores, okay? Okay, interesting stuff. Okay, this was a con job right from the start, con job. Now, once we understand that that's what income tax is, now we're ready to cope with it. Okay, it's an illegal thing. It doesn't even exist. What did I do? Misspelled sovereign? Good reach. There's me in here. Okay. Okay. All right. So they tried to get the income tax in. They couldn't get it in for 66 years now, every year. Now, the problem was that they had these senators that didn't want to pass this. The Senate wouldn't pass it, see? Now, we have to, first of all, take a look at the 17th Amendment, okay? Because the 17th Amendment is the election of senators. In the original Constitution, or Constitution for America I, it said that, okay, if you wanted to have the senator was the control that a state legislature had on the federal government. Okay, and for 66 years, the state governments kept sending their guy to Washington and say, no, we don't want a federal income tax. Why would Louisiana or why would Ohio want a federal income tax? So they kept blowing this thing out of the water, you see. And so they said, okay, what we have to do is change the representation of the Senate. Now they call it the direct election of senators. I mean, direct election of senators certainly sounds good, doesn't it? But let's take a look at what it really is, okay? My dad, wise that he was, when I was in high school and I got my first job, he says, I'd like to explain something to you. He says, this is a paycheck. And he says, the employee receives the paycheck, okay? And this is the amount. And he says, it's signed by the boss. He says, really very simple system. He says, if you want another paycheck, you just make this guy happy. But his job is not to make you happy. He says, you have any problems? He says, remember that. He says, because you're there for his benefit. He's not there for yours. Got the picture? That's the relationship between a boss and an employee. Now, before 1917, okay, the employee was the U.S. Senator. And the boss was the state legislature. So if the state had something going on in the federal it didn't like, it would have the senator cancel it. Isn't that interesting? In 1917, they changed bosses. From 1913 on, it's no longer the state legislature, it's the federal government. The senator no longer represents the state government, he represents the federal government. That's why when you write your state senator, like Red Cranston, we call him Red Cranston because that's not the color of his hair, but that's the color of his voting record. Okay, what happens here is that he always explains to you why he votes the way you don't want him to vote. He never really says, oh yes, that's the way I should do it. He has not voted for the benefit of California. He's voted for the benefit of the central bank ever since he's been there. He knows where the bread's buttered. And the state for the last 80 years has had no representation at all. It's totally powerless. Isn't that interesting? You see, this had to happen before they could get an income tax. The second thing they did was they had to change the 16th Amendment, which said, okay, now you can have a direct tax. Now it's okay for the servant to tax his master. Well, if the servant can tax his master, you've just had a role reversal, haven't you? You've just had a change of master, that's all. That's interesting, isn't it? See, that's like the old Aesop's fable about the donkey, that the guy was going off and he's leaving the donkey, he was selling the farm and left the donkey, and he says, well, I suppose you're glad to get rid of me, huh? And the donkey says, well, it doesn't make any difference. He says, change of ownership doesn't mean freedom. See, isn't that interesting? We just had a change of ownership, didn't we? All right? So these two things happened along with a third thing in 1913. Very bad year. Very bad year. They introduced the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System is simply a central bank. And now the United States government will go into debt to private individuals unnamed and unknown. Well, there was a book written called Secrets of the Federal Reserve back in the 50s by a fellow named Eustace Mullins, probably the finest book on the market as to the Federal Reserve System. Mullins went in and he found out who owned the Federal Reserve System. I won't go into a big long story on it. It was interesting. But the Federal Reserve System is 52% owned by the Rothschild Bank. Isn't that interesting? Out of London. This will start again. I wonder if they got other colors. What do we got here? We'll try a couple more here. Let's see what we got. We got green and red. Let's try that. Okay. Okay, that's 50. Now, meanwhile, you have some other things here. Here's 52% that's owned by, or sorry, 24%, excuse me. 24%. There's more red ones here too. Okay, 24% owned by by people in the United States, and it's 24% owned by people in Europe. Okay, according to Mullins, okay, there are 4 families that own property that own part of the United States. This is the Goldman Sachs Bank. These are banking families. They're not physical families, but they call themselves banking families. The Goldman Sachs Bank. You've got the Lehman Brothers Bank. You've got the Kuhn Loeb Bank, and you've got the Rockefeller Brothers. Okay?